This week's focus is on conflicts in stories. Are you ready to learn about conflicts? Let's take a closer look at the word conflict. Conflict. Let's write the word 3 times on the sheet of paper in front of you. After this lesson, you will be able to clearly state the word conflict and explain it in your own words. You will also be able to identify different types of conflict. Conflict means problem. A problem is a struggle or a bad situation. Write the word problem on the sheet in front of you 3 times. How many types of conflicts are there? When we talk about conflict, we say person versus someone or something. The person in the first part of that statement is the protagonist from the story. There are 5 main conflicts. Person versus self, person versus person, person versus society. The last 2 kinds of conflict are person versus nature and person versus fate. These are the 5 types of conflict. Person versus self conflict. Write person versus self on the sheet in front of you 3 times. Person versus self conflict is when a character is having a conflict with himself or herself. Examples of person versus self conflicts include a character having to make a big decision or choosing between right or wrong. The character is fighting within himself or herself. Person versus person conflict. This type of conflict involves another character. Person versus person conflict involves a problem with another character. This man just got in a car accident with another driver. Person versus person conflict involves a problem with another character. Write person versus person on the sheet in front of you 3 times. Here are person versus person conflict examples. A character being bullied. A character trying to win a competition against others. A character fighting with a parent, a brother or sister, or a best friend. If a protagonist fights against a government, an agency, or society to change the laws that rule the country in a story, it is a person versus society conflict. Write person versus society on the sheet in front of you 3 times. Here are some person versus society conflict examples. A character fights against the law or laws. A character challenges the way society normally handles something. A character tries to change the way the people live or do things in his or her world. Person versus nature conflicts are conflicts in which a character has to deal with an element of nature. In this picture, a character's car has fallen into a crack in the earth. Let's hope the character is able to escape the car in time. Person versus nature conflicts are conflicts in which a character has to deal with an element of nature. Write person versus nature on the sheet in front of you 3 times. Here are some examples of character versus nature conflicts: storms, tornadoes, blizzards, and hurricanes, being stranded on a deserted island, wild animals, viruses, or contagious diseases. Beware of wild animals. Being attacked or chased by a bear would be an example of a character versus nature conflict. This sad character is stranded on a deserted island that is surrounded by hungry sharks. This is another example of a character versus nature conflict. What the heck? This couple is lost in the woods. This is another example of person versus nature conflict. Person versus fate conflicts are problems that the protagonist has to deal with that he or she cannot control. This slide shows a person versus fate conflict because the protagonist's parents are getting a divorce. Write person versus fate conflict on the sheet in front of you 3 times. In a story, when a protagonist cannot control the problem he or she is facing, it is a person versus fate conflict. This is an example of person versus fate because the protagonist's house is on fire. He will need to find a new place to live. This is a person versus fate conflict because the protagonist was born with a bad disease. This is an example of a person versus fate conflict because the protagonist's brother was hit by a car and now he will have to face life without him. This is an example of a person versus fate conflict because sometimes a protagonist's family member is sent to prison. The protagonist has to figure out how to live without him or her. Can you recall the 5 main types of conflict? The first type we talked about was person versus self. The second type we talked about was person versus person. The third type we talked about was person versus society, and the fourth type we talked about was person versus nature. Which type of conflict was missing? Look at the sheet in front of you. Match each conflict with its correct type. Good luck. You can do it.